Mel's Hole is a round pit 9 feet 9 inches in diameter. There's a stone retaining wall built around it that goes down about 15 feet. After that, the hole extends down into darkness. Well, not only did Mel Waters and his wife dump everything in the hole, but so did his neighbors.
There are holes in the earth that feel unsettling just to look at. But then there's Mel's Hole, a place so strange that even experts and skeptics pause before laughing it off.
I just felt I was in the presence of something extraordinary, something beyond extraordinary, something like in that category of having a religious thing. This was just such a...
Back in the late 1990s, a quiet phone call to a late-night radio show lit the fuse on one of the darkest modern legends in America. And true to it, decades later, the question still hasn't gone away. What if Mel's Hole was never just a story? The legend of Mel's Hole. On February 21st, 1997.
There's a lot of weird stuff about this hole. Dogs are afraid of this hole. Animals are afraid of this hole. And he said, in fact, one of my neighbors once told me that his dog died and he threw the dog down the hole. And he said the next morning that dog was on his...
During one of those long, eerie nights that Coast to Coast AM was famous for, a man calling himself Mel Waters phoned into Art Bell's radio show. He didn't sound dramatic. He didn't sound unhinged. If anything, he sounded calm, almost reluctant, like someone finally admitting something he'd been sitting with for too long. Mel claimed he owned land near Ellensburg, Washington, and on that land was a hole. Not a well or a mine shaft, just a perfectly round opening in the ground about 9 feet wide, dropping straight down into darkness.
Another mystery buried deep in the hills of eastern Washington keeps resurfacing, a bottomless pit said to be a pathway to the paranormal. KOMO4's Denise Whitaker heads east in search of the hole.
Locals, he said, had been dumping trash into it for years. Old appliances, car parts, even animals. But here's where it got weird. The hole never filled up. According to Mel, he lowered a fishing line into the opening with a lead weight attached. He kept paying out of line, thousands of feet. Then tens of thousands. By the time he stopped, more than 24,000 feet of line had disappeared into the hole without ever hitting bottom. To put that in perspective, that's several times deeper than Mount Everest is tall. And Mel wasn't laughing when he said it. Art Bell went quiet for a moment. Listeners leaned closer to their radios. Things escalated fast after that. Mel told a story about a neighbor's dog that had died and been tossed into the hole. Days later, the same dog was seen wandering through the woods, alive. Same markings, same limp. Another version of the story claimed dogs were lowered partway down the hole, barking loudly at first, until suddenly, at a certain depth, the barking just stopped. Not fading, not echoing away, just gone. Silence, like the sound hit a wall. But the part that pushed the legend from creepy to conspiratorial was when Mel claimed that government officials eventually showed up and sealed off the area. The excuse was a plane crash, but Mel said there was no wreckage, no debris, just guards and warning signs. He went on to say the government offered him $3 million a year to lease his land, money that briefly appeared in his bank account before vanishing without explanation. And here's the detail that still rattles researchers today. When journalists and investigators later tried to verify Mel's identity, they found no official records of a Mel Waters living in that area. No property deeds, no paper trail. The man was a ghost, but his hole was treated like a reality. So was Mel's Hole an elaborate hoax, a misunderstood natural phenomenon, or something far stranger? And if the hole was real, what would happen if modern technology finally looked inside? The scientific expedition. The story should have died in the late 90s. Most radio call mysteries do. But Mel's Hole didn't fade, and for scientists, that was the problem. Claims like this don't just poke curiosity, they poke physics. And physics doesn't like being poked. That's why geophysicists didn't believe a word of it at first. She openly said that when a man called into Coast to Coast AM on February 21st, 1997, claiming a hole swallowed more than 24,000 feet of line, the explanation wasn't supernatural. It was temperature, pressure, and boring old geology. According to known models, as you go deeper into the Earth, the geothermal gradient kicks in. Temperatures rise fast. Past a certain depth, any open shaft should hit rock hot enough to destroy equipment, or cause materials to sublimate straight from solid to gas. In plain terms, a hole like Mel described shouldn't stay open, and nothing mechanical should survive very long down there. And yet, the hole never collapsed, at least not according to the stories. What bothered geophysicists most wasn't the depth claim. It was the silence around it. No confirmed location, no verified land records, no meltwaters in the area. The man was a ghost, but his hole kept showing up in conversations that refused to die. That contradiction was the hook. So the team did what skeptics do best. They stopped arguing and started measuring. Instead of ropes or fishing lines, they designed a drone, a serious one. Cerberus 1, a modern scientific reconstruction, wasn't just built for views. It was built for data, fiber optic tether for a constant signal, reinforced housing to handle pressure shifts, and most importantly, a modified gravimeter tucked into its sensor suite. They called it the chronal sensor, a device tuned to detect gravity anomalies measured in milligals or mgal. Here's why that matters. Gravity isn't perfectly even everywhere on Earth. Tiny changes in gravity can reveal what's underground. Dense rock pulls harder. Cavities and low-density zones pull less. Negative gravity anomalies often point to voids, fractures, or something hollow that shouldn't be there. If Mel's hole were just a narrow shaft, gravity readings should stay stable. If it wasn't, the numbers would drift. They didn't even get the drone fully over the opening before the first anomaly appeared. It was small at first, a fractional negative shift, barely above background noise, but it was accelerating. As the specialized drone hovered closer to the hole's mouth, gravity readings dipped further, as if mass was missing beneath their feet. Experts flagged it immediately. This wasn't normal erosion. It suggested a subsurface structure far larger than a simple hole. The team's tech lead had another problem on his mind. The Earth rotates. That sounds obvious, but it matters here. Drop an object straight down a deep vertical shaft, and it won't fall straight for long. Because the surface moves faster than the interior, the object drifts sideways and eventually slams into the wall. That's basic physics, and it's why dropping anything deep into the planet is harder than it sounds. That's where the tether came in. The fiber optic line wasn't just for video and control. It actively stabilized the drone, compensating for counter-rotation and lateral drift. Without it, the drone would pinball into the walls within minutes. With it, they could keep the drone centered, steady, and alive. As the drone crossed the threshold and began its descent, the gravity anomaly deepened. The chronal sensor showed a smooth curve downward, like gravity itself was thinning. Not spiking, not fluctuating, just steadily dropping, and that made no sense. According to established models, even massive underground caverns have limits. Rock collapses, pressure equalizes, nature hates empty space. But the readings suggested something sustained, something vast, extending far beyond what any known geological process should allow. And then came the temperature data. Instead of climbing rapidly with depth as the geothermal gradient predicts, the heat curve flattened. It didn't cool, but it didn't rise the way it should have either. Geophysicists stared at the numbers in silence. This was the point where theory said the drone should start failing, but it didn't. The drone kept descending. The tether stayed taut. The sensors stayed alive. And the gravity anomaly continued to grow. So here's the question that changed the tone of the entire mission. If this wasn't a normal hole and it wasn't obeying the rules we understand, then what exactly was the drone moving into? Passing the depth. No one expected. At this point in the descent, something feels wrong. Not scary yet. Not supernatural, just wrong in a way that makes scientists sit up straighter. According to the modeled data, the drone passes a depth that should already be impossible. Not unlikely. Geologists estimate that the Earth's continental crust averages around 30 to 40 kilometers thick. Below that lies the moho, the boundary where crust gives way to mantle. Rock density changes, temperature spikes, pressure becomes unforgiving. Open voids should collapse long before this point. And yet, in this reconstruction, the drone keeps going. Scientists theorize that once the drone crosses this depth threshold, the readings should change abruptly. Seismic behavior should shift. Gravity should stabilize or even increase slightly due to denser material below. Temperature sensors should show a predictable rise based on the geothermal gradient. But the modeled data suggests none of that happens. Instead, gravity begins to dip. Not dramatically, just enough to be unsettling. This is the kind of anomaly that doesn't make headlines on its own, but it sets off alarms in labs. A localized drop in gravitational pull implies missing mass. Something beneath the drone is less dense than it should be, or structured in a way that defies typical geology. Many viewers believe this is where Mel's story stops sounding ridiculous and starts sounding uncomfortable. Because if a hole really extended past the moho without collapsing, it wouldn't just be deep. It would be disconnected from the rules that shape everything above it. As the descent continues, modeled pressure data adds another layer of tension. Pressure increases, but not at the expected rate. It is as if the surrounding material is no longer pushing inward uniformly. Scientists theorize this could only happen if the shaft is not interacting normally with the surrounding rock. In simple terms, the hole is behaving less like a tunnel and more like a boundary. And in science, boundaries matter. People still search for Mel's hole today because this is the moment where explanations start to fracture. The deeper the drone goes, the more the math stops agreeing with itself. Then something else happens. Sound disappears. Not gradually or like echoes fading into the distance, just gone. According to acoustic modeling, sound waves sent downward should bounce back differently as pressure and density change. Instead, the simulated signals cancel out completely at a specific depth. No echo, no distortion, silence. Scientists theorize this could be caused by a low-frequency pressure wave that interferes with normal sound propagation. If two waves are perfectly out of phase, they cancel each other out. This is a real physical phenomenon used in noise-canceling technology. But here's the unsettling part. The modeled interference wave does not originate from the drone. It originates from below. That silence lines up disturbingly well with the old reports. Dogs are going quiet. Barking stopped instantly. In this reconstruction, silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of something actively erasing it. And that's when the gravity readings begin to behave in a way scientists struggle to explain, even theoretically. The first anomaly. At greater depths, the drone enters what researchers can only describe as a gravitational contradiction. Modeled data suggests the presence of a localized gravity well. Gravity increases slightly, then decreases, then stabilizes again. The pattern repeats, not randomly, but rhythmically. This is where scientists reach for extreme comparisons. Black holes are often used as examples because they represent gravity taken to its limit. At the event horizon of a black hole, space-time is warped so intensely that time slows dramatically relative to an outside observer. This is known as time dilation. No one is suggesting Mel's hole contains a black hole. The mass required would destroy the planet. But scientists theorize that gravity can behave in strange ways without massive objects if space-time itself is distorted on a small scale. Modeled data suggests that at a certain depth, the drone passes through a thin zone where gravity behaves inconsistently with mass. The pull changes direction slightly. Timekeeping instruments drift out of sync by fractions of a second. Not enough to notice casually, enough to notice if you are watching closely. This is where theorists introduce the idea of a localized space-time anomaly. Not a portal, not a tear, but a region where space and time are slightly misaligned compared to everything above it. Some researchers refer to this as a null field. Not because nothing exists there, but because normal rules cancel out. Inside this zone, sound interference peaks. Gravity fluctuates. Data transmission becomes unstable. Signals don't just weaken, they arrive out of order. In practical terms, the drone's camera feed begins to lag behind its sensor data. Temperature readings update before visual confirmation. Depth markers drift by milliseconds. To most people, that sounds trivial. To physicists, it's terrifying. Because time should not behave differently inside a hole in the ground. People still search for Mel's hole because of moments like this. Not because of monsters or resurrection stories, but because even a hypothetical reconstruction exposes cracks in what we assume is solid reality. As the drone descends further, modeled visuals suggest the shaft walls change texture. Not smoother, not rougher, just different, Light behaves oddly. Illumination drops off faster than distance alone can explain. Scientists theorize this could be due to extreme absorption of photons or scattering effects caused by unusual material composition, or something else entirely. The drone's downward motion began to slow, despite no mechanical resistance being applied. Gravity weakened just enough that descent became unstable as tether tension fluctuated without explanation. Then came the first true anomaly. The drone stops accelerating. It did not stop moving, it just stopped falling. According to physics, this should not happen. If gravity exists, objects accelerate toward mass. If gravity weakens, objects drift. But in the modeled data, the drone appeared suspended in a narrow vertical band where upward and downward forces cancel out almost perfectly. Not an equilibrium caused by mechanics, but an equilibrium caused by geometry. During this time, space itself appeared to resist motion. Scientists theorized this zone could function like a membrane, a boundary between regions that obeyed different rules, just like a filter would. And that idea reframes everything. If such a membrane existed, it would explain why objects disappear without resistance, why sound vanishes instantly, and why depth becomes meaningless beyond a certain point. It would also explain why no one has ever proven Mel's claims conclusively. Anything sent down might not return the same way, or at all. As the drone hovered in this zone, data degradation accelerated significantly. The signal began to flicker, not from distance, but from interference. The silence intensified, and even internal systems registered anomalies. At this depth, scientists agreed on only one thing. Continuing the descent would risk losing all data, and that leaves one final question hanging in the dark. If this membrane is real, what happens when something crosses it completely? And is Mel's hole just deep, or does it lead somewhere depth no longer applies? The abyss, crossing the threshold. The moment the drone crossed what scientists theorized as the chronal membrane, everything changed. It wasn't like hitting a shelf of rock where instruments suddenly spiked or dropped. It felt like crossing an invisible line in the air itself. The onboard clocks began to drift. One ticked ahead, while another lagged behind. Engineers monitoring the simulated descent noted something shocking. The drone's clock was registering delays. It wasn't a malfunction, and it wasn't lag from transmission. The system showed a 4-minute delay for every real minute, suggesting that time itself had decoupled from the world above. This wasn't fiction. Modeled data suggested it was a result of a localized gravitational anomaly, something well outside normal crustal behavior. Suddenly, the visual feed began to degrade. What had been crisp video transformed into strange, high-contrast frames that flickered as if electricity itself had lost coherence. Noises in the feed turned into static that didn't correspond with signal loss, but with temporal distortion. That's when the simulation adopted a found footage aesthetic. For those who don't know, this is the most accurate way to imagine how the descent might have appeared in real time. In this state, both signal and time slipped. Yet the drone kept going. Once past the membrane, the drone entered an environment unlike anything expected. It wasn't rock, it was a cavity, but open in ways that defied conventional geometry. Modeled visuals suggested a vast space stretching in ways that made depth perception meaningless. Instead of a simple shaft, the cavity seemed bounded by smooth, obsidian-like surfaces. Scientists theorized that these weren't carved stone, but structures that reflected light in baffling ways, almost like polished glass, only denser and darker. Light bent around them, creating multiple vanishing points that shouldn't exist in a cylindrical tunnel. Engineers running the models reported, "We were steering straight," but the structure reflected what appeared to be our previous positions. These walls shouldn't exist like this. Modeled data suggested that space itself had folded back on itself. Straight lines didn't stay straight, and light behaved unpredictably. Many viewers believe this part of the descent resembled a simulation of warped space-time rather than a terrestrial shaft. It raised an eerie question. If the interior behaved like a warped space rather than a tunnel, what did that mean for physics as we know it? The temporal interference wave. Before this point, the simulated descent had already shown odd pressure readings, but nothing dangerous. Sound still traveled normally through the drone's audio feed. But as it entered the warped cavity, a more subtle, terrifying effect emerged. At first, it didn't sound at all. It was a vibration, a low pulse beneath human hearing. In conventional physics, sound propagates as pressure waves through a medium. Here, modeled data suggested a wave that wasn't just low frequency, it was out of phase with all regular sound waves. This mattered because when waves are perfectly out of phase, they cancel each other. Noise-canceling headphones use a similar principle, but what the models suggested was far beyond that. A ubiquitous pressure wave that canceled all conventional sound instantly. The moment the wave activated, audio disappeared entirely. Not faded, just gone. Scientists theorized this was active cancellation, a phenomenon where every conventional sound wave traveling through the space encountered an equal and opposite pressure wave that nullified it. This corresponded eerily with reports that had made Mel's hole famous. People still searched for explanations after claims that dogs refused to approach, birds avoided the area, and no echo ever returned. Once the temporal interference wave took hold, sensors began to glitch. Temperature readings froze, depth references became inconsistent, and the drone could no longer determine its orientation. It was as if the environment had canceled not just sound, but the drone's ability to measure itself. Researchers running the hypothetical model stopped referring to the descent as geological exploration. They called it an encounter with a physics-defying environment, where space and time behaved more like a relativistic field than a conventional Earth shaft. And then, the signal collapsed entirely, without any visuals, audio, pressure, or temperature data. Just silence. Not empty silence, but interference silence. Many viewers believed this was the point where reality itself seemed to flicker. And that left the most haunting question. If such a zone existed beneath the Earth's crust, would it represent the deepest point in space, time, or something else entirely? And as we ponder on that, was this just a structural anomaly? Or were we witnessing a phenomenon bending the very fabric of reality? The terrifying footage. Everything changed the moment the drone's live feed crossed that threshold. What had begun as a controlled descent into an unexplained geological anomaly shifted into something far more unsettling. Up to that point, the visuals had been stable and the instruments predictable. But as the drone moved deeper, it appeared as though the rules governing the environment were no longer consistent. By the time the camera passed what scientists theorized might be a zone of extreme space-time distortion, subtle irregularities were already visible. The onboard clocks began to drift, registering delays that couldn't be explained by transmission lag or hardware malfunction. Modeled data suggested the discrepancy wasn't happening to the signal alone, but to time itself. Video frames slipped out of sync, the image flickering sharply before degrading into a grainy, unstable feed. Anyone watching the footage later described a growing sense that something fundamental had changed. Then the visuals began to bend. What researchers later described as non-Euclidean distortion emerged across the screen. In everyday geometry, space behaves predictably. Distances are consistent, angles add up. But in certain theoretical models, space can curve so dramatically that straight paths no longer behave as expected. That was the closest comparison scientists could make to what appeared in the footage. Instead of rough rock or jagged stone, the drone seemed surrounded by smooth, dark surfaces that reflected light in unnatural ways. Edges warped. Depth became impossible to judge. The environment looked less like a tunnel and more like a cavity where space itself folded inward. Scientists theorized that the drone had entered a region where gravity, or something mimicking its effects, was warping space-time enough to distort perception and light. Many viewers believed this was the most disturbing part of the footage, not because something attacked the drone, but because the environment itself felt wrong. It didn't behave like Earth. Then, the audio began to fail. At first, the sound feed degraded into irregular static, but seconds later, it vanished entirely. There was no gradual fade, no crackle, and no final burst of noise. Just silence, complete and immediate. Scientists later proposed that the drone may have encountered what they referred to as a temporal interference wave. Modeled data suggested the presence of a low-frequency pressure pattern capable of canceling conventional sound waves entirely, similar in principle to active noise cancellation, but operating on a far larger and more extreme scale. Instead of absorbing sound, the environment appeared to nullify it. This detail unsettled researchers because it echoed long-standing reports associated with the site, claims that no echo ever returned. Those animals avoided the area. That sound seemed to vanish rather than reflect. People still search for explanations because this element appears again and again across unrelated accounts. As the silence persisted, the drone's other sensors began to behave erratically. Temperature readings froze. Depth measurements contradicted each other. Orientation data became meaningless. It was as if the environment wasn't just disrupting sound, but interfering with the drone's ability to define its own position in space. Then came the final anomaly. For a brief moment before the signal collapsed, the video feed displayed what looked like a human silhouette. The shape resembled the lead scientist involved in the hypothetical mission, but was altered in a way that defied explanation. The figure appeared aged, distorted, and out of sync with the present moment. Scientists were careful not to label it as evidence of time travel. Instead, they classified it as a paradoxical visual artifact. One possible interpretation suggested the environment may have caused overlapping temporal reference frames, where past, present, and future information blurred together. Another proposed that it was a projection caused by extreme space-time distortion affecting light and memory buffers in the system. No conclusion was reached. Seconds later, the feed cut out completely. No video, audio, or data. Not a loss of signal in the conventional sense, but a collapse, as if the environment itself rejected observation. Many viewers believe this moment marked the true boundary of the phenomenon. Not the deepest point reached, but the point beyond which reality no longer allowed itself to be recorded. And that left one question unresolved. If the environment could erase sound, distort space, and scramble time, what exactly had the drone entered? The covert retreat. The silence didn't just swallow the drone, but the entire story too. After the feed collapsed, there was no dramatic recovery mission, no public follow-up press conference, or even leaked footage that suddenly appeared weeks later. Instead, what followed was something far quieter, and in many ways, far stranger. The story simply began to fade. Scientists who reviewed the hypothetical models later pointed out something unsettling. In most exploration narratives, even failed missions leave behind data, corrupted files, partial logs, some measurable aftermath. Here, there was nothing. No final ping or debris trail. It was as if the event had reached a boundary where observation itself stopped being allowed. And that's where the legend of Mel's Hole quietly re-entered the picture. Long before modern simulations and drone reconstructions, Mel Waters had already told the world a version of this ending. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, he regularly called into Coast to Coast AM, describing a hole on his property in Washington state that seemed to have no bottom. At first, his claims were strange, but oddly consistent. Objects dropped into the hole never hit anything. Animals avoided it. Sound didn't echo back. Then the stories escalated. By the time of his final calls around 2002, Mel claimed the hole had changed. He said it was suddenly filled with a white fibrous material. He spoke about government interest, about land seizures, about barriers appearing where there had once been open forest. And then, without explanation, he vanished from public conversation entirely. Many viewers believe this disappearance is what keeps the story alive. Not because it proves anything extraordinary happened, but because it mirrors a familiar pattern. When legends collapse under scrutiny, they usually do so loudly, but Mel's story didn't do that. It just stopped. And silence has a way of making people uneasy. When researchers later compared Mel's claims to real-world geology, the contrast was stark. The deepest hole humans have ever successfully drilled is the Kola super-deep borehole in Russia. It reached over 12 kilometers into the Earth. That alone took decades of effort, cutting-edge engineering, and constant battles with heat and pressure. Even then, the project was eventually abandoned because the conditions became too extreme. At those depths, temperatures climbed beyond what drilling equipment could handle. Rock didn't behave like solid stone anymore. It flowed. It warped and closed in on itself. That project represents the absolute ceiling of human capability beneath the Earth's surface. Against that reality, the idea of a naturally occurring bottomless hole in Washington state becomes almost impossible to defend. There is no geological record supporting it. No verified survey or government study acknowledges such a feature. From a scientific standpoint, Mel's Hole should not exist, and yet the story refuses to die. Part of that is because Mel never framed himself as a scientist or an expert. He sounded like a regular guy describing something he didn't fully understand. That alone made people listen differently. Another reason is timing. His calls happened during an era when the internet was still fragmented. Fact-checking wasn't instant. Stories had time to breathe. And Coast to Coast AM specialized in that liminal space between skepticism and wonder, where unanswered questions were allowed to linger. But the most persistent element of the legend has nothing to do with the hole itself. It's the military angle. Mel claimed that at some point, the land around the hole was seized. These claims, however, were never verified, but they never fully disappeared either. Locals debated them quietly as online forums kept revisiting them. People still search for maps, satellite images, or anything that might suggest the area was ever closed off. And that's where things get interesting. Because while there is no evidence of a bottomless hole, there is also no clear, public explanation for why the story abruptly ended the way it did. Many viewers believe the covert retreat is the real story here. Not that something supernatural was discovered, but that something uncomfortable was encountered. Something that didn't fit cleanly into known categories. Something that made continuing the narrative more trouble than it was worth. But here's the twist. Even failed legends leave behind questions. Why did Mel keep calling for years if the story was fabricated? Why did he escalate instead of retreating? Let's leave some room for your input. Because if something doesn't exist, it can be disproven. If something exists, it can be studied. But when something sits in between, half story, half silence, it becomes harder to erase. Tell us what you think about Mel's Hole. Is it real? Is it a hoax or some alien portal to Neverland?